Welcome back to the Tarikamba podcast and videocast. I'm your host, Solomon Caprige. Today we will have our question answer session in regard to the episode concerning the Yekatit 12 and Debre Libanos massacres, which we put out earlier this month. Thank you very much for the very kind compliments that many of you sent in regard to that episode, but we did also receive quite a few questions, and I will try to address those as best I can. Yekatit 12, as we mentioned in the episode, refers to the Gregorian date of February 19, which was the date that the massacres in Addis Ababa began. So the first set of questions, which I will try to answer today, concerned the Yekatit 12 monument itself. The Yekatit 12 monument, as you will have seen in my episode, and which you see here, is a tall white obelisk with bronze reliefs going around it depicting scenes from the massacre and from the ceremonies that followed the liberation, in which the victims of the massacre were honored. It stands in the middle of Yekatit 12 Square, which is the official name of the square, but it is more regularly informally referred to as Siddiskiro Square. Siddist means six, which refers to the 6 roads that feed into the roundabout square. It is located outside the southern gates of the Addis Ababa University's main campus. That campus was previously the Ganetel-ul Palace, which was built by Emperor Haile Selassie as his primary residence, and which at that time was the headquarters of the Viceroy of Italian East Africa, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani. This was the location where an assassination attempt was carried out against the Viceroy, and which triggered the massacres. Also in the square is the Yekatit 12 Hospital, previously known as the Emperor Haile Selassie I Hospital, where Graziani was rushed in order to save his life and where he was operated on, which is also the location of the place where he ordered the massacres to begin. The present monument was dedicated in 1955 by Emperor Haile Selassie, who had earlier commissioned it in Yugoslavia while he was on a state visit there. The obelisk replaces a much simpler column that stood in the square previous to that. Emperor Haile Selassie commissioned the present monument during a visit, as we said, in Yugoslavia, and he commissioned it from a noted Croatian sculptor by the name of Anton Agustinic, who collaborated with another prominent sculptor named Franko Krišnić. Both Anton Agustinic and Franko Krišnić were Croatians. They were considered to be among the most prominent sculptors in Yugoslavia. Both were born when Croatia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and lived through both world wars, and through Croatia becoming first part of the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, later the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So they had seen a great deal of the turmoil and had survived the fascist aggression in Yugoslavia as well, which was a very turbulent time in the Balkans. Agustinic studied at the Arts and Crafts College of Zagreb, which became the Royal Academy of Arts and Crafts, and later he went to study in Paris at the École des Arts Décoratifs and the École des Beaux-Arts. Krišnić came from a family of stonemasons, and he had studied stone sculpting in what is now the Czech Republic. Krišnić is famous for the statue of Nikola Tesla that stands in Niagara Falls State Park here in the US. For those of you who have been to Niagara Falls, you may have seen the statue of Nikola Tesla, a copy of which stands outside Belgrade's School of Engineering as well. So these two gentlemen actually sculpted this beautiful monument in Addis Ababa, which again was dedicated in 1955. Agustinic went on to do other sculptures in Ethiopia, other big monuments. One of these is the beautiful monument to the Ethiopian partisan, which stands outside the Holeta Gannet Military Academy in Holeta, which is in western Shoa to the west of Addis Ababa. It is a tall column topped by a running Ethiopian soldier and is dedicated to those Ethiopian patriot fighters who resisted the Italian occupation. Also, Augustinich, in collaboration with the Ethiopian artist Afar Tekli, designed and sculpted the beautiful equestrian statue of Emperor Haile Selassie's father, Ras Makonnen Walde Mikael, who was a hero of the First Ethio-Italian War and fought at the Battle of Adwa, and he was also governor of Hararge, which was a province in eastern Ethiopia. And this statue stood in the city of Harar, but sadly it was senselessly toppled and broken up during a recent episode of ethnic unrest. It is our hope that this statue will be restored in the future. We've also received several questions regarding how many surviving Arbenuch or Patriot soldiers are alive today. These events happened 85 years ago, so the majority of the people that were alive then will have passed on by now. However, in speaking to Lij Daniel Joti Mesfin, who is the head of the Ancient Ethiopian Patriots Association, he tells me that about 200 of these Arbenuch survive today. Certainly most of the perpetrators are gone. Those people who survive today would either have been, very young and would now be in their mid to late 80s, and those who were a little bit older than that would be in their 90s and 100s. The Ancient Ethiopian Patriots Association plans to build a museum commemorating the events of the occupation and in particular the events of Yekatit 12 and other terrible atrocities that occurred during the Italian occupation. This association was founded to serve the veterans of the resistance against fascist Italy, and it is currently headed by Lij Daniel Joti Mesfin, who is the son of Ras Mesfin Selassie, one of the foremost leaders of the resistance during the occupation. In the episode, we talked a lot about the ends of many of the fascist leaders who largely escaped punishment following the war, but not a lot about what happened to the Italian royals who bore the brunt of the punishment for the crimes of the fascists. Now, the Italian royals were certainly complicit and presided over fascist Italy, and so of course bore some portion of the responsibility, but again, in a country where the monarchy was largely symbolic, they were not the main perpetrators, and you would think that the main perpetrators would get the harsher punishment. But as we discussed in the episode, the actual perpetrators of atrocities in Ethiopia and elsewhere, actual members of the fascist party, largely got away with their crimes, and the only senior Italians that were punished were the royal family. As mentioned in the episode, King Vittorio Emanuele III overthrew Mussolini with the help of Marshals Badoglio and De Bono and brought Italy into the Allied camp. He renounced the thrones of Ethiopia and Albania as illegitimately acquired in 1943 and recognized Emperor Haile Selassie and the still exiled King Zog as the legitimate monarchs of these two countries. However, due to his previous accommodation of fascist rule, the king's popularity and that of the monarchy suffered a lot in Italy. And when a referendum on the monarchy was set for June 1946, the king hoped to help the chances of the royalist cause by abdicating in favor of his much more popular son, who became Umberto II. And Vittorio Emanuele went into exile in Egypt. King Umberto II reigned for just 1 month in May 1946 before losing the referendum and leaving Italy to go into exile in Portugal. All the males of the House of Savoy were expelled from Italy and barred from ever setting foot on Italian soil again. This included not just the elder line of the House of Savoy, but their Aosta cousins as well. King Vittorio Emanuele III was received with great honor by King Farouk in Cairo. He settled in Egypt with his wife Queen Elena, and he died there in Alexandria in December of 1947, just a year after going into exile. Because of his association with the fascists, the avenue named in his honor in Paris was changed and renamed in honor of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. King Umberto II lived very quietly in Cascais, Portugal, until his death in March of 1983. The other major royal figure from that time was Prince Amadeo, Duke of Aosta, who was a cousin to both Kings Vittorio Emanuele III and Umberto II. He had served as the last viceroy or viceré of Italian East Africa from 1937 to 1941. He and 7,000 Italian troops had abandoned Addis Ababa and tried to hold out on fortified Ambadagi in Tigray, but with their water supply compromised and besieged by 9,000 British and 20,000 Ethiopian troops, they had no choice but to surrender. The Duke of Aosta surrendered on the 18th of May in 1941. The British allowed the Italians to surrender with full honors of war. The Duke was interned as a prisoner of war in Kenya in a rather notorious camp for Italian prisoners of war, where he died of the combined effects of tuberculosis and malaria. He is buried there in Kenya to this day. The remaining associated figure from the Italian royal family would be King Umberto II's son, Prince Vittorio Emanuele, who's today referred to as the Prince of Naples, whose birth was the cause for the ceremonies at which the attempted assassination was carried out on the then Viceroy Graziani. Prince Vittorio Emanuele is one of the few figures that's still alive today. He and other males of the Savoy family lived in exile, but were permitted to return to Italy in 2002 when the constitutional provision barring them was repealed. He currently lives in Switzerland, and he and his cousin, the current Duke of Aosta, contest the headship of the Savoy family today. The current Duke of Aosta is the great-nephew of the last Viceroy of Italian East Africa, whom we just mentioned. In Ian Campbell's 2017 book, The Addis Ababa Massacre, Italy's National Shame, it is estimated that 19,200 people were massacred over the 3 days of the Yekatit 12 massacre. That would have been about 20% of the city's population. Most Ethiopian sources, however, maintain that 30,000 people were butchered between Yekatit 12 and Yekatit 14, which is February 19 to February 21. A lot of the questions that I received, or I should say comments that I received, were about the scale of that massacre. So considering that Addis Ababa was a much smaller city back then, of approximately 60,000 inhabitants, which is roughly the size of the modern town of Arba in southern Ethiopia, for those who are familiar, the number of people that was killed, whether it was 19,200 or 30,000 people, was a significant portion of the population of Addis Ababa. That's between 20 to 45% of the entire population of the city. That means every single family was affected. They lost at least one, probably more members of every family. Extended family, close family, friends, acquaintances. Everyone in Addis Ababa would have been closely affected by those massacres. Sadly, I don't think a whole lot of those of us who are Addis Ababans or descended from Addis Ababans know the names of very many of these people who were killed. Many of these people were young people and perhaps didn't have a chance to have children yet. So there was no one to carry on their story. So a very good portion of that population is forgotten, which in many ways is extremely tragic. My maternal grandmother was named Wezero Askale Yimam. She fled Addis in 1936 when the Italians occupied the city in May of that year, and she went to stay with cousins who were living in Holata, which, as I mentioned earlier, is to the west of Addis Ababa. She herself thus escaped the horrors of that massacre. However, she had two brothers, Kabede Worku and Tafari Imam, who were killed during the Yekatit 12 massacres. Now, the interesting thing is my grandmother had many siblings, and they have many descendants. So I always knew about her many siblings who lived and their descendants, thanks to them having a lot of descendants and me knowing them and being in touch with them. But I had never heard of her two brothers who were killed. And I think it's a common trait across the world where when things like that horrible massacre occur, people don't talk about a lot of the horrors that they went through. If you look at survivors of the Jewish Holocaust in Europe, or the atrocities carried out in Cambodia, or even the Red and White Terrors in Ethiopia, you will find that there are a lot of people who prefer just not to talk about the suffering and loss they went through. And I think that is part of the reason why a lot of us don't know about our family members who were victims during the Yekatit 12 and Debre Libanos massacres, because people just did not want to relive the trauma and just did not discuss them. I found out about my grandmother's brothers, her two brothers that were killed, rather ironically, when she died here in New York. When my grandmother died here in New York, one of her relatives came to mourn with us, and in the process of wailing a dirge, which is common for older Ethiopians to do, she mentioned these two brothers who had predeceased my grandmother. And that's the first time I learned of my great uncle's names and when and why they died. So it underlined for me the importance of maintaining personal histories, because they connect us in many ways to these earlier times. They make history more real. And it's very important to search out and find out what your personal connections are to these events. Many of you who are listening or watching me right now probably have relatives that were affected. So if you have grandparents or great-grandparents or parents who were either around at the time or knew about relatives who were around at the time and have stories, I encourage you to ask them what happened, what their experiences were during these horrific events, because those are the things that make history more personal for all of us. There were also quite a few questions about other figures in the plot to assassinate Marshal Graziani, and they mentioned that I didn't mention a few of them. And yes, I focused on the main characters, but there were other people clearly behind the scenes that worked towards carrying out this assassination attempt against Marshal Graziani. One of the names that comes up the most often is Ethiopian nobleman by the name of Bajirond Letibaru Gabri. He later became a Dejazmach, which is a higher title, Dejazmach Letibaru Gabri. He survived the massacres. He escaped to Addis Ababa and was able to join up with the resistance in northern Shawa under the command of Ras Ababa Aragai, was probably one of the more prominent and well-known members of the resistance. Dejazmach Letibelu survived the war, and unfortunately was among the nobles and ministers which were killed in the Green Salon massacre at the Gannatalul Palace during the unsuccessful 1960 coup against Emperor Haile Selassie, which we will cover in another episode. There were other figures that were involved, or were purportedly involved. There was Haji Bedasso, who is believed to have actually acquired the grenades that were used in the attack, and that he brought them from Aden, which was at the time a British protectorate. And there was a young man named Beliho Degafu, who was beaten to death immediately after the assassination attempt. He is often mentioned as possibly the third person throwing grenades at Graziani on Yekatit 12. But there is some dispute about that, but he was certainly a victim and beaten to death on Yekatit 12. There were other questions about Debre Libanos Monastery. A lot of people commented about the pictures of Debre Libanos that I put up. The church that was in the pictures that I had on that episode was the old church at Debre Libanos that has been replaced. As you know from the episode, the monks were all massacred at the Debre Libanos massacres. The monastery was reconstituted with new monks after the restoration of Emperor Haile Selassie and the liberation of Ethiopia. And the present church was built over the tomb of Saint Tekle Haimanot. It was commissioned by Emperor Haile Selassie in the 1950s, and it was designed by a Greek architect named Professor Hector Corfiato, and he was from the Bartlett School of Architecture at the University of London. There is some dispute I found, which is very interesting, about Hector Corfiato's nationality, whether he was Egyptian or whether he was Greek, but he was a very talented modernist architect who designed the Debre Libanos Monastery. That covers most of our questions. If you have any further questions, feel free to send me new ones, and we will address them in future Q&A sessions. I'd like to dedicate this episode to my great uncles, Kabeda Wargu and Tafari Imam, and all the other victims of the Yekatit 12 massacre, and the many victims of the Debre Libanos massacre that followed soon after, and all the victims of fascism in Ethiopia and elsewhere around the world. I encourage everyone to try to find out a little bit more about your personal histories. What happened to your families during those times? Thank you for joining us, and be well. Thank you for joining us for this latest episode of Tariq Amba. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our videos, and share with all those you think would be interested. Follow us on social media. Tariq Amba is on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Send any questions you may have to solomon@tariqamba.com and visit our website at www.tariqamba.com. Thank you, and see you next time.